So we talked a little bit about conflicts of interest already in terms of journalism ethics. And one of the main sort of guiding principles that I like to use when I do reporting and when I do writing is not only going according to the outlet that it is that I'm writing for, their rules and regulations, which are often covered in contracts, but also, does this feel right? Sometimes it's as simple as just, does this sit right with me in terms of whether this is an ethical thing, whether it's a moral thing, or if it could potentially get me in trouble. Now, this is something that I've had many years and years and years to kind of be able to recognize, which might not come as easily or quickly to you as you're just starting out. But you know, one of the first things that is fairly obvious to a lot of people, but not to others, is to write about family and friends in your stories. So say you're given an assignment to talk about, let's say, the building boom in Ethiopia. And you know, it's somewhat of an opinion-oriented piece, or it's a reported piece. We'll go with reported instead. You want to get some opinions of people that live in the community about what's happening here in Addis and how they feel about it. So one of the easiest things to do would be to turn to your mom and say, Mom, tell me what you think, you know? Is it a great thing? What do you think about it? Or, you know, call up your brother and ask your brother for his advice. And you may want to talk to your family and friends because you know they have opinions and they're very articulate with their opinions, but that's a conflict of interest. And as it says here, you know, most newspapers bar reporters from writing about or including quotes from family members or friends, although there can be some exceptions. The exceptions include stories that you are writing about yourself. In that case, it's okay. An autobiography, like we talked a little bit about yesterday, or memoir is fine. But whenever you are reporting for a newspaper or a magazine, you also have to be very transparent or clear about where your sources come from. So we've talked a bit about transcripts. We've talked a bit about written transcripts as well as audio transcripts. You should be very clearly saying, this is who I talked to. If it's like some person that you just pulled over on the side of the road, for instance, their contact information, so that if the fact checkers or researchers want to follow up to see the credibility or to make sure that the interviews and the reporting are consistent and accurate, they should have no problem knowing exactly who it is that you talk to and being able to have that information. And they should not include someone that you know necessarily, unless it's specifically something that is related to something you're writing about yourself. So that's one example of a conflict of interest. And these next few examples, I usually look at within the context of written journalism, but we'll show some examples of conflict of interest for different forms of journalism, whether it's radio or television or written a little bit later on. You want to take this next one?
Sure. Press junkets, in the UK we don't tend to call them that, it's just press trips. So I'll give you a very good example. I've just, as I said yesterday, before I came to Addis, I was on a trip to Marrakesh for an organization that shall remain nameless. And I was going there for CNN. And CNN does not have budget to pay for any trips unless has been decided by very senior editors. But at the same time, they do not prevent you from taking trips. So I had negotiated with the organizers to be able to come and cover their event. And then to my surprise, 2 weeks before the event, I received a contract from them saying, Eliza Anyangwe will be doing these things while she is here. She will interview this person and publish the story within 2 weeks of it going up. She will do this and this and this. Now, I was very offended and angered, and I called them and I said, I will not be coming because I do not work for you. I work for my news organization, and you cannot determine what I do. The idea that a press junket or a trip which is paid for should be refused is something that applies in theory, but as I said at The Guardian, we will write a disclaimer at the bottom of the piece, and I have an example to show you, that says, this trip was paid for by these people. So we understand that the story is still important to tell, and it is a story that we wanted to tell, but it is not a story that we would have been able to afford or had the finances to cover ourselves. So we are making our readers know that the way the story came about was because of someone else's finance. And that opens you up to questions about influence, as we were talking about before, but we always try and counter that with transparency. Cultural stories or lifestyle, travel, right? Mm-hmm. Almost always music. For a travel story or a music story, it is if you get offered a trip to the Maldives, spend 7 days and the organization has thought about the story. Sometimes you're not dealing directly with the organization, you're dealing with a press agency that are trying to get coverage for the organization. That is how those stories tend to be told. So the question is, how do you avoid, now in your experience, would you turn down a trip to the Maldives?
Absolutely not. Freelancers sometimes have, more leeway than people on staff.
Yes.
Freelancers, that's one of the great benefits of being a freelance writer, right? You could pretty much, depending upon which outlet you're writing for, the outlet may jump at the opportunity for you to be sent to the Maldives because they could never begin to pay for it. Now, of course, there is some degree of expectation from the tourism board that you are going to participate, for instance, in some of the activities they plan for you. Mm-hmm. However, it is up to you as a journalist, or I'll speak in my experience, I'm fairly candid about the fact that I'm going to write exactly what I want to write. But at the same time, I am aware of the fact that, the more money some of these tourism boards put toward your trip, the more they have expectations. Mm. So sometimes you can find a way to maybe have your news outlets pay for part of the trip, or reimburse you for part of it so that it's not completely on the tourism board, or you just make it clear up front, I'll be participating in this activity, but perhaps not that activity. So there is some room, there can be some room to negotiate. It can be a little bit tricky. I'll give you an example. I think I shared this example the other day about this New York Times story that I have been negotiating, where it's been made very clear to me I am to accept no gifts and no travel, even if the person that I'm talking to is in another state or another country. That expense is on me. And how it works is that you ask for approval in advance of the New York Times or a similar outlet to have that money reimbursed. But often, it can come out of the reporter's own pocket. Now that's that's probably one of the stricter policies of newspapers that I know of. But in that way, the newspaper seeks to maintain the highest level of integrity possible. And that's one of the hallmarks of the New York Times, in that, it garners a lot of respect because people understand that those policies are in place. So I would say that, as a freelancer, I came out here and, part of what I'm going to be doing is writing stories when I go home for different outlets. I can do that because I work for freelance outlets and they don't have policies about where the money comes from and that sort of thing. So, that can be sort of like a pro and a con of being a freelancer, coming out of your own pocket to have to pay for things, or being able to participate in things, where it's not necessarily that you're going to have to pay for it. But the point that Eliza made so very clearly is that transparency is key. And never be afraid to ask if you don't understand a contract, if you're not sure of their policy, it's not written clearly. Some places aren't as thorough in their explanation of their policies unless you request them. So that's an area to always be on the lookout for. And similarly, it's the same with hospitality. If I'm a guest of a restaurant, and this has definitely happened before, where you're asked to write like a restaurant review or something, one of the ways that maybe the magazine will avoid possible impartiality is paying for your meal. Maybe the restaurant will throw in a soft drink, but they can't expect that you're going to give them a 5-star Michelin review as a result of a soft drink. But if they're giving you a 5-star course or 5-course meal, and they're picking you up in a limousine from your home and bringing you back, and then they're bringing in the celebrity chef, they're looking to get something a lot of times in return for that. They're looking to influence you in a way that will definitely sway, because who's not going to be swayed by being able to have, caviar or whatever it is, and, $10,000 bottles of Hennessy. This has happened to people, aged, really expensive. And I'll also go to say that you will feel better about yourself and your own quality of work to be able to say that no one has influenced you improperly to tell something that's not true. The worst thing that I know of is having, in addition to being kind of running afoul of the policies, is being known for being a writer who accepts these types of bribes, who people don't trust, or they don't believe them because they're cozy with everyone and they can't accept, or they don't think that they are impartial. I think that's another way to ruin your reputation. So there's not only the professional part of it at stake, but the personal part of it at stake. You have to ask yourself, what is it worth to you? What is it worth, 15 or 20 years worth of journalism to kind of have your reputation destroyed on something on one trip? You have to ask yourself that.
As we were preparing for this lesson, I was reading over Guardian policy, and they say to accept chocolates is fine, to accept money is not fine. To accept flowers is fine, to accept a trip abroad is not fine. And the question is not just the gifts that you receive, it's offering gifts to people who are your contacts or sources, so is it okay if you're working on a story to buy dinner for the person you want to interview or the person you're trying to get an appointment with? Is it okay if you are, you said, okay, well, my newspaper is sponsoring a festival, and let me take these clients of mine, let me take these people, these sources of mine to the festival because it's being paid for by my organization. Is that okay? And so there's always questions about what constitutes a gift when you're giving it as well as you're receiving it. Now, there are often baselines in terms of the value. If the gift is below a certain value, and at the Guardian that I think is £50, then you can accept it. If the gift is higher than £50, then you shouldn't accept it. If you're ever in doubt about how much it is worth, you're told to refer to the managing editors. But as you see, there is a certain, which seems to me as we were preparing, a far more sort of ease with these things, it seems to me, in the British press than in the American press. We seem far more able to negotiate than it seems. And I would assume, I would say that The Guardian is probably the equivalent of the New York Times in terms of reputation, in terms of reach, but we have a lot more of a laid-back attitude.
Laissez-faire.
Yes, a much more laissez-faire attitude. The question is always, are you transparent? So even if you're offering a gift, if you are taking sources for a meal or whatever, that there should be a documented record of it. And are you transparent? And if it affects your journalism, or if it could affect your journalism, are your readers aware of it?
Eliza makes a good point also. in regards to the timing of the gift. Are you receiving a gift before you write the story or after you write the story? You know, I'll say that when I was writing for Essence years ago, I found an artist, a fine artist that we wanted to interview for the magazine, and quite, you know, just through internet and sources, but like not anyone that I knew or was related to anyone that I knew, interviewed her and did a small story. It wasn't a very big story, and you know, a few weeks later, she sent me a painting that she'd done. And I accepted that gift. One, because it wasn't that she was doing it to influence me. It was a small gift. I would have estimated the value fairly low, and I also told my superior about it.
I was just thinking there about some bigger changes that are happening in the media, especially, you know, in England at the height of the recession in 2008, 2009, where the money that was, you know, paying for journalism, advertising. So when you put an advert in the newspaper, that is handled by a commercial team who are very far away, mentally, emotionally, in every way possible from the journalists. And advertising revenue is what is funding journalism. Now, the big financial crisis of 2008, 2009 that is still being felt today really hit advertising revenue hard. And it means that it's probably the reason that has forced a lot of newspapers to think more about being digital, to think more about how do we get revenues online, but also it has changed the relationship between the editorial team and the commercial team. So you have new media organizations that are starting up or that are growing, Vice, for example, or other ones in the States, or even The Guardian, with revenue, with money from vested interests. And the question is always then, now that that sort of division is no longer there, how do we maintain editorial independence? How do we maintain our reputation? How do we maintain quality? Now, I think the one thing that we have learned is that when you have things like sponsored content, which is content that has been explicitly paid for, and advertorials, sometimes when that is actually well written, well made, I think BuzzFeed has their same editorial team also create their sponsored content. When that is good content, your readers can enjoy it anyway. The question is, are you transparent about what is paid for and what is independent? So we are finding at The Guardian that that readers like a good story, and that actually they have quite a high tolerance for sponsored content, and they're fairly happy if they trust the news source to go with you on a journey where you're trying to figure out how much and how you're going to remain financially viable. Every time I meet someone, because The Guardian is very well known in the UK for not having shares, it's not a private company. We are run by a trust. And so every time I meet someone in the UK and they say, oh, you work at The Guardian, oh, you must be losing so much money. Because they know our financial situation, because we're not market operated in the same way as other companies. But they love our journalism, and so they have a very high tolerance for if we're saying, look, we're experimenting with different models and different types of sponsorship. So the question would be, in Ethiopia, what is the traditional models through which journalism is being paid for? Do people know and understand that? How does that affect how they consume media? You know, do you know who owns the newspapers you read or the radio stations you listen to? Do you know how that has an impact on the story that you're creating or reading or trying to write? And if you do, then that's good. That's because that's what we need. It's just transparency in the system. And we tend to find that the readers will hold us accountable anytime that they see something that seems like a conflict of interest. When you're created media literacy, when you have an audience that read and understand and know what's going on, they will hold you accountable to make sure that you're not being corrupt or dishonest in any way.
I'm a good example of a journalist who has done both hard news journalism and feature journalism as well as advertorial writing. one of the jobs I had in the early 2000s was a position in what's called a custom publishing division of Time Warner or Time Inc. in the US. So custom publishing means that they take traditional journalists to create advertorial content. Advertorial is a combination of advertising and editorial, literally. So my job was to be an editor as well as a writer for a publication that Time Inc. wrote and produced on behalf of Ford Motor Company. So Ford Motor Company, of course, being one of the top car companies, automobile companies in the US. So it was all advertorial content, from the top page to the back page. It was all content geared toward getting you to buy a car. Whether it was, writing about products that you can purchase to go inside of your car, whether it was writing a feature story to give you the idea of the experience of driving in a Ford truck, And so you will read the story and you'll get into it because you're like, that's a cool experience. But at the end of the story, there might be a link directly to Ford Motor Company website where you can check out said truck. You can see how much more each of the items that they have already advertised to you in the product section will cost if you want to buy a fully loaded truck. And you can also see, kind of like any of the other related stories that they have, all with the intention of getting you to be a consistent Ford customer. So that's an example of the type of advertorial content, as well as the type of relationship a traditional media house, Time Inc. publishes. Sports Illustrated, People Magazine, Time Magazine, some of the most prestigious and well-read and popular and highly circulated magazines in the United States. And they also happen to work for Ford Motor Company, American Express, several other huge names, creating the same type of content, just with a twist, which is it's biased. But it's biased in a way that the company has paid for, and therefore Time Inc. is benefiting from the advertising. So, it all comes back to asking yourself or expecting and holding responsible companies for making it very clear when something is sponsored content.
If you're taking money from an organization and the organization is out of the news, then it doesn't matter. Do you then, when they are in the news and it's for bad reasons, do you then have the freedom to report on them? I think that any situation, as journalism changes in terms of how it is funded, and the two lines between editorial and commercial get blurred, organizations are going to have to ask themselves those questions, and someone is going to have the responsibility of ensuring that whether it is good news or bad news, the money that comes in from an advertiser does not influence how we cover that advertiser. Now, the truth is always that it is easier said than done. A couple of examples I can think of. The Telegraph magazine was in a lot of trouble in the UK recently because one of their largest sponsors is HSBC, the bank, and HSBC was up to some dubious practices in the banking market, and the Telegraph would not report the story. Even though the other competitors were doing so, the Telegraph sort of danced around it until one day a former very senior journalist at the Telegraph retired and then wrote an article for another newspaper saying how he had been ignored or shut out every time he tried to get his own organization to report on the HSBC scandal. So that is one example where the real life sort of difficulty within the newsroom of, do we want to tell this story and risk upsetting this sponsor that's offering us a lot of money? I was saying yesterday how Vice has had a similar situation, Vice in the States. They received sponsorship from an NFL team, or quite a lot of advertising revenue from this American football team. And there was a reason to report negatively about them, and the journalist got an email telling him very rudely to leave the story alone. And then he cut and pasted that email onto Twitter, and everybody started sharing it, and then Vice had to apologize. So there is these daily challenges between, if you take money from organizations. So, a lot of sections of The Guardian, some of the things that make The Guardian the organization it is, our coverage of international development, our coverage of cities around the world, our coverage of regions of the world. So we have something called the African Network, the Russia network, even the North Korea network, where we're trying to get reporting and to tell stories of these parts of the world that are usually out of the news. All those areas of reporting at The Guardian are sponsored. And each section, so the cities section is sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. Our global development reporting is sponsored by the Gates Foundation. All those organizations have logos on our website. Now you can imagine the first time any of those logos appeared, Guardian readers were like, what the hell is this, right? But we now have guidelines. So under the logo, it says, sponsored by or whatever. And there's a link that says, find out more about this content that explains the relationship between us and the sponsor. So the Gates Foundation is never allowed to influence our global development reporting. Now, the question then becomes a question for the editorial team. If the Gates Foundation is in the news over something negative, we have to make sure that we're covering that story as well. But it doesn't exclude us from receiving lots of tweets and lots of comments from people saying, oh, this thing which is very important to me. So for example, some people believe that the Gates Foundation has a very negative influence on agriculture because they support Monsanto, which is into genetically modified agriculture. So you have a lot of environmentalists sometimes who come onto the Guardian website to say the Guardian is not covering this situation properly because they're getting money from the Gates Foundation. And then you always have to have some senior journalist or some senior editor or the reader's editor come and write a reply saying, no, we're not. This is either the reason why we chose to or not chose to cover that story. Here are our guidelines that we're supposed to be following. So in a world where we are winning awards for our international development reporting, in a world where very few other news organizations of our size are reporting on global development issues, there seems to be an overwhelming case for us to continue doing so, but it comes with risks. And the risks is, will we always be in the position where we are free to report negatively about our sponsors?
Two things to piggyback on what Eliza has said. Some newspapers have what are called ombudsmen in the States. And they are pretty much known as the integrity officer, if you will. Their job is to hold their publication accountable to a large degree as to the content that is covered. And it is to, in the case that she shared around offering a rebuttal or to explain why the newspaper covered or did not cover something, contextualize it within the context of integrity. So sometimes you will find that the ombudsman within a newspaper is at direct conflict with what has already been reported in the newspaper because that is their job. It's kind of a system of checks and balances even in-house. And so, that is some ways that newspapers have at least someone who helps to address any questions or potential questions of impropriety, an ombudsman. And then I'll say that Fox News channel in the U.S. Is considered to be a tool by many of the Republican Party. The Republican Party being one of two of the primary political parties in the U.S. And so there's always kind of an interesting conversation going on as to whether, depending on what side of the political spectrum you fall on, whether or not you can believe anything that is being reported on Fox News. Because the idea is that if it is sponsored and paid for and there's more of a bias toward hosting Republican governors and senators and other news outlets that also believe in the same philosophies that are espoused by Fox News Channel, whether or not they can be objective. Then on the other side, you will find that people who are Republican or more conservative with their political leanings will say it's absolutely unbiased. So this is where you have to decide for yourself, based on your knowledge of what is being presented in the press, your knowledge as to who is funding whom, which companies are behind which companies. You'll find that more and more, there are these huge media conglomerates or individuals that own so much stake and so much of the publications that you could argue that there's not the ability to be unbiased at all. It really depends on your thought about that maybe person or the organization, but it just goes to show how very complex it can be and how confusing at times who to believe. If you read a story about Monsanto and you find out later that their advertisers are these farmers who work toward have this kind of practice on their farms, or it's difficult to then believe almost anything that is said from that point on. So that's why it's important to know, or to at least pay attention to who runs what and maybe why. Is
Fox News sponsored by the Republican Party?
It is not overtly said that it is sponsored by. This is again kind of where opinion comes into play. And what you believe perhaps the individuals who own it, what their personal agendas may be. It's hard to say, but it's all about your impressions based on what you see and who you see, whether or not they, in your opinion, cover things in a fair and balanced way, which is their slogan, or if they tend to mostly go with the opinions of people on one side, one party, and not the other. So paying sources. I can't say I'm gonna pay, you $500 to tell me your perspective on, what's happening, the war on terror or something like that. Or, $500 for whatever reporting you have that is unique or that no one else has. Just because I want to get something from you that no one else has, for instance. No other journalistic outlet has been able to get this information. I cannot pay you for it. This is something that I'm sure is probably covered differently. I know it's covered differently different places. So again, it's important to know what your organization's policy is, because in some cases, for instance, there are news outlets, specifically like television shows, that do offer, if it's not direct cash, it is money toward an organization that this person supports or some other kind of incentive. And it's okay with them. But if it's like a hard news story that you're trying to get a source for, most of the publications that I know of will not go there.
We know that if somebody says, here is, we will come to you first, that's fine. But if they say, we will come to you first, we'll give you an exclusive interview if you write about this person in a certain way, that is not fine, because it's setting up conditions for that access. So, just always, and sometimes it feels less harmful because it's not cash or gifts, some sort of, favorable exchange, but it is just as important in terms of your ethics. What I love about the internet is that we can now find out about all sorts of things about people, right? So if you are, and sometimes it might not even be as overt as giving finance. For example, I'm not an American, but I would imagine that there is a deep conflict of interest if you're writing a story where you're suggesting perhaps that, guns should be better regulated, or maybe the other way around, shouldn't. And and then there is a picture of you holding two AK-47s on your Facebook page, right? There will be a clear sense of people calling into question your credibility, your objectivity, your distance from the subject matter. And so it's in many ways that journalists have not had to previously. Our own personal interests are now more visible than ever, right? Who you are as a human being and not just as a byline is becoming so much more important. And so people can now find this information out about you and call into question your own personal affiliations, the organizations you donate to. So I support refugee charities in the UK. And I'm sure that other news organizations, if I was to be the one writing stories about why the refugee crisis is dreadful and why our government needs to do more, some people will just say, oh, but she has that view because she was born in Cameroon, and look, she gives X amount of money a month to a refugee organization. So they will imply a bias. Does that mean that I am no longer in the position to write the articles? Not necessarily, but it means that decisions now have to be made about what stories I tell and what I don't. And so actually, the question about political and charitable donations is one that is even more interesting now because of our broader affiliations and because we are so much more visible as people who are on social media and social networks. And I would imagine here, especially because of how people use Facebook, then to be conscious of how your information is public on Facebook and how decisions might be made about your bias or your objectivity or subjectivity when covering different subject matters based on the information you're posting on your Facebook page.
And that's a perfect segue into blogs, because blogs don't have to be these formal, separate entities anymore. It could be your long posts on Facebook espousing your opinion, or your opinion that you share on Twitter. Blogs are obviously your own personal domain to write about what you think about, but don't think for a second that if you cover, the crime beat for, the Daily Caller, and you are, supposed to be objective, but then you are completely tearing apart the opposition, the judge and the jury who made decisions on that same crime case on your personal blog, that people are not going to look at both of them and question your objectivity. So some of the ways that journalists that I know of get around this is that they simply do not cover stories, or they simply do not cover things in their blog that they write about professionally. So say if someone is they write for the Sports Illustrated and they cover basketball for a living, maybe in their spare time they write about jazz, or they write about parenting. There's not so much of an obvious correlation between the two based on subject matter. Or perhaps you don't want to share your opinion at all on things. If you are a reporter for a publication, you may choose to not even give people the opportunity or the potential to make form impressions about you based on what you write on your personal blog, and use that knowledge against you in terms of what you may cover for the newspaper or the magazine that you work for full time. So it's a personal choice as to whether or not you maintain both. Having a blog in and of itself, it can be a great tool to get your name out there and to gain some visibility. As someone who's maybe breaking into this market and maybe does not work full-time for some place, but also keep in mind that because of the internet, everything you ever write will be there. So if you do want to get a job in the future writing about a certain subject, remember that a blog can come back to haunt you in terms of whatever opinions you have shared previously prior to that job. So these are just different things to keep in mind in terms of potential conflicts of interest and things that could be called into question around your integrity and your ability to remain objective.
I mean, I feel like that subject is even broader, right? It's just the question about what are the things that can harm your ability to tell stories and to tell the kinds of stories you want to tell for the types of organizations you want to tell them for. Something as simple as your email address, can do that. When people got very excited about creating email addresses for themselves, and you were calling yourself, Flyboy 1979, or that affects your credibility, right? So what is your email address and what does it say about you? If you're Foxy Girl, 72 or whatever, that email address, when you send that as a, requesting or pitching an idea, even before I have read your pitch, I'm looking at your email thinking, not a very serious character, right? So everything about how we interact in the digital space, from what we choose to be on our emails, to the picture we put on our Facebook, to the picture we put on our Twitter profile, you know, and I see this a lot more in the States, where American journalists include a disclaimer in their Twitter feed, you know, what does it say? Things like...
Yeah, I did the same.
Oh, what is it called?
These are views that are held only by me and not by my organization.
Yes. These views are not shared by my organization. And for me, who is a social media purist, it really annoys me when I see these disclaimers. But I understand why they exist, because in theory, Twitter is supposed to be the space where you are able to talk, right? It's a great democratic platform. But because newspapers and news organizations and journalists are using them to find stories, to report, it now has become professionalized, and marketing organizations existing in that space, etc. So people are now having to put disclaimers where they're saying, these are not the views of my organization. I must admit with you that I'm often not sure where to draw the line between what I say on social media and what I don't. For example, CNN had made a mistake where I think in an article, CNN USA, I must admit CNN International is a bit more, it's a bit better at this, but CNN America had called Kenya a hotbed of terror. And Kenyans on social media were in uproar. And, you know, they were saying compared to, I mean, is it more of a hotbed of terror compared to places in the States where, you know, there have been acts of terror, for example. And they started a hashtag, someone tell CNN, where Kenyans were tweeting CNN saying, look at these other parts of our culture that you have forgotten to tell. Now, as a very strong Pan-Africanist, but also an employee of CNN, maybe it would have been in my best interest to leave this conversation out, but I also tweeted about it. Now, I haven't gotten into any trouble because as a freelancer, I exercise a certain right to say whatever I like about whichever organization, but I must admit that I have to think sometimes about my ability to then have work, you know, with an organization if I have been verbally critical of that organization. I think if you're starting off in your career, it is probably better to be as neutral as possible, because you might want to make decisions later on about where you want to position yourself. I think the more senior you get in your career, it's like a bit like age. You know, by the time you're 80 years old, you can say whatever you like, nobody really cares. So the more senior you are in your career, the more you can have a certain perspective and opinion. But when you're starting out, please be careful about how things you say online might imply bias and affect your ability to work.
And sometimes your job as a member of the press is to sometimes, you know, take issue with things you see in the press.
Absolutely.
So, you know, for instance, if you're covering race in America and you take issue with how race is covered in certain publications, then that could be your job, but it should be clear that's your job. Absolutely. As opposed to you just kind of going rogue on Twitter saying whatever you want to. Because as they say, screenshots last forever.
Absolutely. And never reduce yourself to a troll, right? Even if you want to say something critical, the idea is that you're always going to work with the kind of professionalism that you expect to be you will be treated with. So if you're critical of something, as we've been talking about yesterday, if you have access to the editors, etc., go and talk to them about it. If you don't, and you feel like, you know, this is something you want to share with your wider social media community, do it in a way that shows intellectual rigor rather than just kind of, you know, brutish force, because it'll always be seen in a better light that way.